I turned the gas dial just enough to hear the hiss, but I didn't light the burner. I walked out of the house, locked the door, and waited for the silence to become an explosion. The silence in the kitchen wasn't peaceful. It was a pressurized chamber waiting for a spark. My wife, Elena, stood by the granite island, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed on the pristine, untouched stovetop. She hadn't cooked a meal since the day I lost my job, and frankly, I had stopped caring about the dust gathering on the range. But tonight was different. She had invited her parents over, the kind of people who judge a man's worth by the char on a ribeye and the crispness of his roasted potatoes. "It's 6 o'clock, Mark," she said, her voice dropping into that chilling register she used when she was done playing nice. She didn't look at me. She just traced a circle in the marble dust with a perfectly manicured nail. "My parents will be here in 2 hours. You haven't started. You haven't even thawed the meat." I leaned against the door frame, nursing a lukewarm glass of whiskey, feeling the familiar burn of resentment crawl up my throat. "I'm tired, Elle. Maybe we order in." "They won't know the difference." She finally turned, and the look in her eyes wasn't disappointment. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. She walked over to the cabinet, pulled out a heavy cast-iron skillet, and slammed it onto the burner with a clang that vibrated in my teeth. She turned the dial, the electric click, click, click of the igniter sounding like a ticking clock. "Cook," she commanded, stepping into my personal space, her perfume suffocatingly floral. "Cook, or you leave. I am not having my father walk into this pathetic, stagnant house and see that his daughter married a man who can't even put a meal on the table. You want to live here? You earn your keep tonight. Otherwise, the door is unlocked." I looked at the stove, then at the keys sitting on the counter. My hand tightened around the glass. The air felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a massive thunderstorm. Without a word, I walked past her, my shoulder brushing hers. I reached for the gas dial, the old-fashioned range we'd kept because she insisted on authentic cooking, and I turned it. I didn't light the burner. I turned it just enough to let the hiss begin, a soft, serpentine sound that only I seemed to hear. I walked out of the kitchen, grabbed my coat, and stepped out into the biting cold of the driveway. As I locked the front door behind me, I glanced back through the bay window. Elena was standing in the center of the kitchen, head tilted, finally noticing the faint, sweet scent of propane starting to fill the room, her hand hovering over the light switch. The engine of my truck roared to life, but I didn't put it in gear. I sat there in the dark, watching the house. From this distance, the kitchen window looked like a framed painting, a portrait of a life I had spent 10 years trying to build, now dissolving into a toxic cloud of gas. Elena was still standing there, her phone pressed to her ear, presumably calling her mother to brag about the feast I was supposedly preparing. She looked agitated. She paced the length of the granite island, her free hand waving in the air as she gestured toward the stove. She reached out to adjust the burner, her fingers trembling slightly. I watched as she leaned in, her face mere inches from the grates. She still hadn't noticed the smell. Or perhaps she had, and she was too stubborn to believe I would actually do it. She turned the knob again, trying to force a spark, her brow furrowed in annoyance. The interior light of the kitchen flickered as she reached for the overhead switch, the one that triggered the ventilation hood. That was the mistake. The hood was an old model, the wiring frayed, prone to sparking every time the motor kicked in. I felt a strange, detached calm wash over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just observing the end of an era. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, jagged edge of the key to the cellar, the only place where I had stored the few things I actually cared about. The rest? The furniture, the wedding photos, the years of quiet degradation? They were about to become fuel. She stopped pacing. She looked toward the window, her gaze sweeping across the dark driveway where I sat, unseen. For a second, our eyes almost met through the glass. She looked confused, then terrified, as if the realization of the silence had finally hit her. She lunged for the back door, her hand clawing at the lock, but the deadbolt was jammed, a temporary fix I had installed just that morning. She pounded on the glass, her mouth open in a scream I couldn't hear. Then, she stopped moving entirely, staring at the ventilation hood above her head as it gave a high-pitched, metallic whine. A tiny blue arc of electricity jumped from the switch. The flash was silent at first, a brilliant, blinding sheet of white light that turned the kitchen into a silhouette theater. Then, the sound arrived. It wasn't a roar, it was a physical blow, a concussive thump that shook the foundation of the house and sent shards of the bay window spraying across the lawn like shrapnel. I didn't flinch. I just watched the curtains ignite, the flames blooming in the darkness like an exotic, hungry flower. My ears rang, a high-pitched drone that replaced the quiet of the night. Black smoke billowed out of the frame, carrying with it the charred scent of ruined vanity. I shifted the truck into drive, my heart hammering a rhythm against my ribs that matched the flickering light of the growing fire. I had meant for it to be a scare. I had meant for her to feel the fear I felt every single day, trapped in that house. I hadn't meant for the structural integrity of the west wall to give way under the pressure. As I pulled out onto the street, I saw a figure emerge from the debris. It was Elena. She was stumbling, her clothes singed, her hair wild and matted with soot. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, standing in the front yard, were two figures who had just pulled up in a sedan, her parents. They stood frozen, their mouths agape, staring at the ruin of their daughter's life. Elena pointed toward the street, her hand shaking, her finger trembling as it locked onto my truck. She wasn't looking at the fire anymore. She was looking at me, and in her eyes, I saw something that chilled me more than the explosion. She wasn't crying. She was smiling. I slammed on the gas, tires screeching against the asphalt, trying to put distance between us. I needed to get to the highway. I needed to disappear. But as I rounded the corner, I looked into the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. Elena wasn't chasing me, and she wasn't calling for help. She was walking calmly back toward the burning house, reaching into the pocket of her ruined robe. She pulled out a small, familiar object, a set of keys that I thought I had taken with me. She held them up to the moonlight, and then, with deliberate precision, she tossed them into the heart of the inferno. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The sirens were already distant wails in the night, cutting through the smog of my own making. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, and my mind was racing, trying to figure out why she had been holding my spare set of keys. Those keys didn't just open the front door. They opened the lock to the safe under the floorboards of the study. The safe that held the documents I had spent 3 years meticulously hiding from her. The offshore accounts, the identities, the history I had tried to erase before I met her. If those documents burned, I was free. But if she had realized what they were before the heat turned them to ash, I was finished. I reached into my own pocket, my fingers brushing against the keys I thought were the originals. I pulled them out, and my blood turned to ice. They were blank. They weren't keys at all. They were lead slugs, shaped and filed to mimic the weight of the originals. I had been playing a game I didn't even know was being refereed by someone else. I pulled into a gas station, the neon lights buzzing overhead like dying insects. I needed to dump the truck. I needed to change my plates. I climbed out, my legs feeling like lead, and walked toward the payphone, a relic of a different life. I dialed the number, my breath hitching in my chest, praying for a voice I hadn't heard in years. The phone clicked. A heavy, familiar silence greeted me. Then, a man's voice, cold and raspy, whispered, You were supposed to cook the meal, Mark. You weren't supposed to burn the house down with the ledger inside. I looked up at the reflective glass of the phone booth, and my breath caught. Standing in the darkness behind the station, reflected in the glass, was a black sedan with its headlights off. The driver's side door was opening, and a figure was stepping out, someone wearing the exact same coat I had bought for myself just a week ago. I dropped the receiver, the cord swinging in the wind, and reached for the weapon I kept under my seat. But as I turned, the station's power grid hummed and died, plunging me into absolute, total darkness. Then, the sound of a single, slow clap echoed from the shadows behind me. The silence that followed the applause was heavier than the explosion. It was the kind of silence that has teeth. I froze, my hand hovering just inches from the concealed holster beneath my waistband, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The darkness of the gas station lot was total, a void that seemed to swallow the ambient light of the highway. You always were an amateur, Mark, the voice came again, disembodied and smooth. It didn't sound like Elena, and it didn't sound like the man on the phone. It sounded like a reflection of my own cadence, twisted into a mocking caricature. You think you're the first person to realize the house was a cage? You think you're the first one to try and burn the bars down? I pivoted, my boots crunching on broken glass, and pulled my weapon. I fired blindly into the dark, the muzzle flash illuminating the lot in strobe light bursts. With every shot, I caught glimpses of the scene. The overturned trash cans, the warped metal of the pumps, and finally, the figure standing near the edge of the woods. He was wearing my coat. He was holding my bag, the one I thought I'd hidden in the cellar. He didn't flinch as the bullets tore through the air. He just stood there, swaying slightly, like a pendulum. I heard the unmistakable metallic click of a safety disengaging somewhere to my left, not from him, but from the shadow of the station building. I didn't want the house to burn, Mark, the figure in the coat said, his voice now vibrating from a speaker hidden somewhere in the brush. I wanted you to see what happens when the architect stops loving his design. You're not the one who left the gas on. You're just the one who provided the insurance policy. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. I realized then that I hadn't broken away from my old life. I had been pushed exactly where they wanted me to go. The fire back at the house wasn't a tragedy. It was a cleaning process. I was the dirt being swept out, and now that the house was gone, I was nothing more than an open file in a cabinet that had just been set on fire. I bolted. I didn't head for the truck. That was a death trap. I sprinted toward the tree line, my lungs burning, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my nose. Behind me, the sedan's engine roared to life, the headlights snapping on like the eyes of a predatory beast. They weren't trying to catch me. They were hurting me. I stumbled over a gnarled root, sprawling into the mud. I scrambled to my feet, but a beam of light cut through the trees, pinning me to the forest floor. I shielded my eyes, squinting into the blinding glare. A silhouette stepped out of the driver's side, tall, lean, and holding a phone. "Pick it up, Mark," the figure commanded. It was Elena. But it wasn't the Elena I had left in the kitchen. She looked clean, unblemished, her hair pinned back with clinical precision. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding a tablet, her thumb hovering over a red button on the screen. "Pick up the burner phone in your pocket or I press this. And trust me, you don't want to see what happens to the rest of the accounts when I hit delete." My hand went to my pocket, trembling violently. My fingers closed around the cheap plastic of the burner phone they had planted on me days ago. A phone I thought I'd thrown into the river. It was vibrating. I pulled it out. The caller ID didn't show a number. It showed my own social security number, flashing in bold red text. I pressed it to my ear, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Start talking, Mark," Elena said from the distance, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell them why you killed me. Tell them the whole story. I've got the call recording, the GPS logs, and a very eager prosecutor on the other end of this line waiting for a confession. You have exactly 30 seconds before I send the final version of your life to the feds. Oh, and by the way, the man in the coat? He's not waiting for you. He's already in your car, and he's got the ignition bypassed. I looked back at the gas station lot. The truck was gone. The only sound was the distant wail of sirens, growing louder, closing in on our position. I was surrounded by the woods, by the evidence of my own failed life, and by a woman who had orchestrated my ruin with the casual grace of a chess master. I looked at the phone, then at the forest behind me. I heard a twig snap nearby, not from the direction of the car, but from the darkness right behind my shoulder. Someone was breathing down my neck. I didn't turn around. I just stared at the screen, the 30-second timer counting down. 05. 04. I opened my mouth to speak, to beg, to scream, but before a sound could leave my throat, the screen of the phone went black, and the voice of the person standing directly behind me whispered into my ear, "Don't bother, Mark. We already have everything we need." The voice behind me was cold, dry, and terrifyingly familiar. It was the voice of the man who had been my mentor in the organization I thought I'd escaped 3 years ago. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My muscles were locked, paralyzed by the sheer mechanical realization that I had never truly left. I was a puppet whose strings had been cut just to see if I'd fall in the right direction. "You really thought you could just cook and leave, didn't you?" the voice whispered. A hand, heavy and calloused, rested on my shoulder, not in a gesture of comfort, but to ensure I didn't bolt. "You left the gas on, Mark, but you forgot one simple rule of our trade. You never leave a job unfinished. You were supposed to stay in that kitchen. You were supposed to be the one they found among the cinders." I felt the cold barrel of a pistol press against the base of my skull. It wasn't the heavy, crude weight of the piece I'd hidden in my truck. It was the refined, silenced precision of a professional's tool. Elena was still standing by the car, her silhouette framed by the harsh glare of the headlights. She wasn't watching me anymore. She was looking past me, toward the highway. The sirens were deafening now, a frantic, swirling mess of blue and red light reflecting off the low-hanging clouds. The police weren't coming for the fire. They were coming for the crime scene that was about to be established here, in the mud, in the dark. "Elena," I croaked, my voice barely audible over the wind. "Tell me this isn't what it looks like." She laughed, a sound so devoid of warmth it felt like a razor blade sliding across my skin. "It looks exactly like the end, Mark. You were the perfect Mark. An angry, desperate man with a hidden past and a penchant for impulsive violence. The perfect fall guy for a cleanup operation that needed to look like a domestic dispute gone wrong. The insurance policy wasn't on the house. It was on you." She stepped forward, the light catching the sharp, predatory lines of her face. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small metallic flash drive. She held it up, dangling it by a silver chain. "Everything in here links you to the offshore server. The explosions, the laundered funds, the bodies they haven't found yet. By the time the police reach us, you'll be a suicide by cop, and I'll be the grieving widow who barely escaped the madness of her deranged husband." "The timer," I hissed, my brain racing through the fog of terror. "You said you had 30 seconds. You said the timer was the key." "The timer wasn't for me, Mark," she replied, her eyes narrowing. "The timer was for them." She gestured toward the woods. Suddenly, the darkness erupted. Beams of tactical flashlights crisscrossed the clearing, blinding me, disorienting me. Men in dark, tactical gear surged from the trees, silent and efficient. They weren't police. They were cleaners. My mentor behind me didn't hesitate. He shoved me forward, spinning me around just in time for me to see his face. It was Miller, the man I had reported for embezzlement back in 2021. The man I thought was dead. He looked older, scarred, his eyes sunken into his skull, holding a remote detonator in his free hand. "The house is gone," Miller said, his voice flat. "But the ledger inside the safe? We managed to pull it out before the roof caved in. You really should have checked the floorboards for bugs before you started your little rebellion, kid." I looked at the tactical team, then at Elena. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't working against each other. They were working together. I hadn't been running away. I had been part of a training exercise in loyalty, one that I had failed spectacularly. "You're not going to kill me," I whispered, the absurdity of the situation finally sinking in. "If you kill me, the ledger means nothing. You need me to open the last vault, don't you? The one that requires a biometric scan." Miller's face twisted into a cruel grin. He stepped closer, the muzzle of his gun pressing harder against my neck. "You're right, Mark. We do need the scan. But we don't need the whole man." He reached out and grabbed my right hand, pinning it against the hood of the car. Elena walked over, a small surgical kit in her hand. She opened it, revealing the gleam of cold, sharpened steel. "We have time," she said softly, touching my cheek with a gloved finger. "The police are still 5 minutes out. That's more than enough time to get the scan we need, one way or another." She raised the scalpel, and the red light of a laser sight appeared on my chest, bobbing slightly as Miller aimed his weapon at my heart. I looked at my hand, then at the forest behind them, where I suddenly noticed a flicker of movement. Someone else was there, hidden in the brush, watching the entire exchange. Someone I hadn't expected to see for years. Just as Elena began to lower the blade toward my wrist, a single, sharp whistle cut through the humid air of the forest, a signal I hadn't heard since the day I first left the organization. Miller froze, his eyes darting toward the tree line. "No way," he breathed, his grip on my shoulder loosening. From the shadows of the trees, a figure emerged, holding a weapon of their own, but they weren't aiming at me. They were aiming at Miller. And as the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the figure's face, I felt my heart stop completely. It was the one person who should have been burned to ash in the kitchen. "Put it down," she said. Not Elena, but the woman standing in the brush. She looked exactly like Elena, down to the same scar on her chin, the same ring on her finger. Elena dropped the scalpel, her face turning a sickly shade of white. "I told you," the newcomer said, stepping into the light. "I don't like it when people play house with my life." Before anyone could react, the figure fired, not at the group, but at the fuel tank of the idling sedan. The world turned into a fireball, and as the shockwave knocked us all off our feet, I felt a hand grab my collar and drag me into the deep, unforgiving black of the woods, a voice hissing into my ear. "Don't look back, Mark. Run, or you're going to be the next thing that burns." The explosion was a white-hot wall of sound that slammed into my back, sending me sprawling into the damp, pine-needled floor of the forest. I didn't think. I scrambled, my fingernails digging into the earth like claws, dragging myself deeper into the shadows while the world behind me turned into a jagged silhouette of fire and twisted metal. My lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass, and the ringing in my ears was a high-pitched scream that drowned out the shouting. I didn't stop until my hands met the cold, wet stone of a ravine wall. I huddled there, gasping, my chest heaving as I tried to regain some semblance of control. Beside me, the figure who had pulled me from the fire was breathing just as hard. I turned, my eyes adjusting to the flickering orange light filtering through the trees. She was my wife. Or, rather, she was the person who wore my wife's face. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the inferno, and for the first time, I didn't see the cold, calculating mask of the woman I had lived with for 10 years. There was a raw, jagged exhaustion there, a humanity I hadn't thought she possessed. "They're coming for us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Both of them. Miller and the real Elena, and they won't stop until there's nothing left of us but smoke. The real Elena? I choked out, the words tasting like copper. Who the hell are you? She pulled a small silver pin from her hair and clicked it, revealing a hidden compartment. She extracted a microchip, holding it up between trembling fingers. I'm the one who did the work, Mark. I'm the one who kept the accounts, who handled the logistics, who lived the life so she wouldn't have to. I was the shadow, the one hired to stand in her place whenever she needed to be somewhere else. But she got tired of the charade. She decided it was cleaner to just delete the shadow and the husband who knew too much. I looked at the chip, then back at the fire. The tactical team was gone, scattered by the blast, but I could hear Miller's voice barking orders in the distance, his tone frantic. He wasn't looking for me anymore. He was looking for the chip. We have to end this, I said, a dark, final resolve settling over me. I looked at my own hands, the hands I had used to turn that gas dial, the hands that had built a lie for 3 years. Miller wants the biometric data. Elena wants the ledger. They think this is about money. They don't realize that I've been keeping a backup of my own. I reached into the lining of my jacket, a secret pocket I had sewn in months ago, a fail-safe for a life I never wanted to live. I pulled out a small encrypted key fob. This isn't just a ledger, I said, my voice steadying. It's the kill switch for the entire network. If I plug this into the relay box at the old power substation near the highway, it doesn't just delete the accounts. It wipes the internal servers, the identity databases, the offshore routes. It leaves them with nothing. No names, no history, no leverage. She looked at me, a glimmer of fear in her eyes. If you do that, you'll be erased too. You won't have a past, a record, or a future. You'll be a ghost. I've been a ghost for years, I replied. We moved through the woods like spirits, guided by the orange glow of the dying fire. We reached the substation, a hulking skeleton of steel and wire, just as a sedan tore onto the service road, its headlights cutting through the trees. Miller and Elena were out of the car before it even stopped rolling, their weapons drawn, their faces twisted with a desperate, hungry rage. They spotted us near the fence. "Mark, don't you dare!" Elena screamed, her voice losing its composure, shattering into a shrill, manic note. I looked at her, the woman I had thought I loved, and then at the substation's primary input terminal. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the key fob into the port and slammed my palm onto the initiation button. The sound was a low, guttural groan, like the earth itself was splitting. The entire station surged with blue light, a massive discharge of electricity that arced through the air, turning the night sky into a chaotic strobe of violet and white. The power grid for the entire sector screamed, then died. In the sudden, absolute darkness, the only thing I could hear was the hum of the cooling systems dying. I didn't look at Miller. I didn't look at Elena. I grabbed the shadow by the hand and we ran, diving into the deep, overgrown culvert that ran beneath the highway. We didn't stop running until the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the world in shades of gray and soft gold. We were miles away, miles from the house, miles from the fire, and miles from the names we used to carry. I stood on the edge of a new town, a place I had never heard of, watching the morning traffic begin to flow. I reached into my pocket. It was empty. The key fob was gone, the documents were gone, and the phone I had used to call the past was buried somewhere under the mud and ash of a life that no longer existed. The woman beside me stood a few feet away, watching me. She was just a stranger now, as lost as I was. "What do we do now?" she asked. I looked at my hands. They were clean. The gas was off. The kitchen was empty. I turned away from the road, toward the dense, uncharted forest ahead, and started walking. "We don't do anything," I said, my voice carried away by the morning wind. "We just start." Behind us, in the city we had left, the news reports would soon start to play. Stories of a mysterious blackout, a house fire with no bodies found, and a trail of digital assets that had vanished into thin air. They would look for us, but there was no one left to find. We were the only ones who knew the truth. And as I stepped into the trees, I realized I didn't even remember my own middle name. The fire hadn't just taken the house, it had taken the cage. And for the first time in my life, there was nothing but the silence of the trees and the terrifying, beautiful weight of being absolutely, finally, no one at all.